This AIMS Professional Learning Challenge focuses on the AVID during reading strategy, marking the text. Our I CAN statement for this challenge is I can implement marking the text in my classroom to empower students to independently decode text. Now, marking the text is a during reading strategy that can be used in any subject area in which students write on a text to help construct meaning. The first step is to number the paragraphs. Numbering the paragraphs will allow for students to quickly refer to specific areas of the text when having a class discussion about the text or when writing in response to the text. Once paragraphs are numbered, students complete a clean read, meaning that they put their pencil down and read the entire passage without making any marks. The purpose of this step is to build familiarity with the overall structure and ideas of the text. Next, students reread the text, marking essential information as they go. One type of marking that they will make is circling key terms or phrases. Depending on the type of text being read, key terms could include key concepts, content-based vocabulary, names of people, places, or dates, formulas, repeated words, or literary devices. Other types of markings they will make are boxing unknown words, underlining important ideas, and writing in the margins. Boxing unknown words is pretty straightforward, but we'll go into more detail on underlining important ideas and writing in the margins in a bit. Here is an example of what a finished marking the text product could look like. Now, what is super powerful about marking the text is that it makes the invisible process of being a strong reader visible for all students. Our struggling readers oftentimes look at our strong readers like they're performing some kind of magic trick. Teachers ask students to make an inference, or determine the meaning of a word, or explain a process that was outlined in a reading, and bam, our strong readers are able to do it. In many cases, our struggling readers have read the entire text. Sometimes they even read it fluently, but they didn't gather any of that information because they're not participating in the metacognitive skills that our strong readers are. Our strong readers are internally making predictions the second they look at a text. They're trying to figure out the most important information in a text. They are determining what words are important to the topic and what words they need to use context clues or a dictionary to help them understand. Marking the text puts all of that internal thinking externally on the page. This is great for our struggling readers who need to practice with these skills externally, get feedback from you, the teacher, and continue to practice before they can internalize these strategies. And it's great for our strong readers, who will eventually encounter texts that they read and can't even begin to understand, who will need the strategy to fall back on later on. In the words of Avid, someday you won't be reading like a college student, you will be reading as a college student. We have all been there, where we are reading a text and we can't seem to understand a single word. Without even knowing it, we probably resorted to strategies not unlike marking the text to help us make meaning of that confusing text. As we know, the purpose of AVID is to prepare students for college and careers. Getting students to practice with these skills in middle school will set them up for tremendous success in high school and later on in college. You may have heard marking the text referred to as the critical reading process, but in fact, marking the text is just one small component of the critical reading process. Traditionally, there are 6 steps that teachers go through when planning a lesson focusing on the entire critical reading process. First, they must establish the learning environment. Then, they must carefully select a text, define a purpose for reading, prepare the students for reading, guide students through marking the text, and assess the reading task. This is way too much to adequately discuss all at once. There will be other professional learning challenges surrounding pre-reading strategies that will prepare students for the reading, and post-reading strategies to assess for the reading task. So for now, we're not going to go into detail on those. I do want to take a moment, though, to acknowledge that when done in its entirety, the critical reading process meets a lot of the criteria set out in our instructional framework that the coaches use when we visit your classrooms. There are 8 criteria pertaining to reading within the instructional framework. And even when done at the most basic level, the critical reading process will help you to score a 3 within clarifying vocabulary, a 3 within clarifying syntax and structure, a 4 within supporting the decoding of text, a 3 within building background knowledge, at least a 1 in setting a purpose for reading, a 2 in interacting with the text, at least a 1 in extending meaning beyond the text. The only one where you don't automatically get points is the promoting and understanding across languages. But certainly if you were to provide the text in a home language or provide students with tools to decode English, you would hit those criteria as well. So the process as a whole is really hitting a lot of the things that we're looking for when it comes to reading instruction. So let's take a moment to look ahead. By the end of this presentation, you're going to be asked to apply your learning by creating lesson materials that will guide your students through marking the text. You're also going to be asked to reflect on how you went about the 4 teacher steps that we are focusing on in this challenge. So let's take a look at those steps, starting with step 1, establishing the learning environment. This step is all about developing a welcoming culture in your classroom where students feel safe to take risks and possibly fail. It involves encouraging students to engage in the challenging academic coursework that you're going to be giving them. It involves you staying true to your high expectations for their reading and writing and not giving in to temptation to lower the bar when students initially struggle. And it also involves increasing the opportunities for students to discuss the text. Students are far more likely to engage with difficult texts when they are given the opportunity to talk about them in the form of a discussion or debate. For that reason, marking the text is a great strategy to use in conjunction with Socratic seminars, about which there is a separate AIM Higher Professional Learning Challenge. So let's talk now about step 2, selecting the text. When you select the text, you want to select a text that's going to challenge students, specifically with challenges commonly encountered with your subject area. You want your students to think as though they are a historian, or as though they're a scientist or a chef. Ask yourself, how can I get students to see what this text has to offer? You selected the text for a reason. How are you going to guide students to get out of the text what it is that you want them to get out of the text? And then what will you have your students focus on while they read? Both of these questions really play into our next step, which is defining a purpose for reading. Earlier we mentioned that one way that students will be marking the text is by underlining important ideas. These important ideas should align with the purpose for reading. Thus, by providing students with a purpose for reading, you're also providing them with guidance as to what to underline. In the culinary example from the previous slide, students would be underlining portions of the recipe that can be done in advance. In the music example, students could underline phrases in the music that seem to match particularly well with the listed dynamic. In the example of finding evidence of the author's opinion, students would underline each example or piece of evidence they could find. In more general terms, if your goal is for students to analyze how an author constructs an argument, they'd be underlining claims and evidence. If the purpose is to summarize an informational text, they would be underlining main ideas and support. If the purpose is to gain background information, they would underline any facts about that person, place, thing, or idea that they're gaining their background information on. Your purpose for reading is also going to guide what students write in the margin. Some things that you might ask students to annotate for include a summary of each individual paragraph, connections to existing knowledge, questions. Now let's get to the meat of it, teaching students to actually do the marking. So the first thing that's important to note here is that you're going to have to model, and model some more. And when modeling, it's really important that you think aloud for the students so they're hearing why you're making the choices that you're making. So for example, this is the third time this word has come up so far, which makes it seem like it is important to this topic. I'm not really sure why it's important yet, but I'm going to go ahead and circle it. Or, oh, we've got a name and a date here. We always want to circle those. Or, the author started this paragraph by mentioning that women earn less money than men, and then she provided some facts and figures to back that up. So this whole paragraph seems to be about women earning less money. Since that looks like it's the main idea of the paragraph, I'm going to underline that whole first sentence. Once you've taken the time to model and to have students write down the annotations that you're making, you're going to start gradually releasing responsibility to them. You'll have students kind of work together in groups to make their annotation, and as they're working in groups, you're going to circulate and clarify any misconceptions you're hearing. You'll probably need to do this for a handful of readings before then releasing students entirely to work independently. So let's see marking the text in action. In a moment, I'm going to model marking the text of a cupcake recipe. But before I do that, I want to talk through the 4 teacher steps involved in the process. First, I considered my purpose. One goal that I have for my students is to cook in a way that is easy and efficient. So I want them to think about what steps can be done ahead of time and what steps should not. Because I knew that was going to be our goal, I selected a text that would have clear examples of steps that should and should not be completed ahead of time. And I picked a text where the ahead of time steps might create some good questions. We're going to act like this is the first time we're marking the text in this class. So when it comes time to guiding students, you're going to see me modeling the steps. You'll hear me really vocalize my thinking to model for students how they should be thinking as they move through the process. You'll also hear me ask some questions that I don't have the answer to, which will help to establish a welcome learning environment where no one is an expert. If you would like to follow along and jot down the annotations I am making, the cupcake recipe that I am using is linked in the Marking the Text Schoology folder. All right, everybody, so as you know, we are working on saving ourselves time and stress in the kitchen. Today, we are focusing on how we can bake cupcakes efficiently and easily. Our I can statement for today is I can mark a recipe to help me make a recipe efficiently and easily. Below here, we have a cupcake recipe that we're going to read through together using the Marking the Text strategy. Here is our purpose for reading. This is what I want you thinking about the entire time we read today. As you read, think about any steps that could be done ahead of time to make baking these cupcakes easier. Also think about what steps shouldn't be done ahead of time. Now we've talked a little bit about marking the text already, but as a reminder, when we mark the text, we are going to number the sections of the recipe. We're going to highlight any action words that tell us what to do in green. We're going to highlight any unknown words in light red. We're going to underline today steps that can be completed ahead of time, since that is our purpose for reading. And then we're going to use the comment feature in Google Docs to define any unknown words, to ask questions, to add explanations, and to leave ourselves helpful pointers that we can use when we go to make this recipe. So we know that all recipes have 2 sections, the ingredients and the instructions. Let's go ahead and number those for ourselves. We've got ingredients, we've got instructions 1 and 2. Okay, and our next step in marking the text is to read through the recipe without making any marks at all. So let's go ahead and do that now. All right, so now that we have read through the recipe once, we kind of have a sense of what ingredients are involved. We kind of have a sense of what we're going to have to do. Now we're going to focus on making those marks so that we have a nice marked up recipe that will help us cook super efficiently. So let's take a look at our ingredients. I see that I have a lot of measurements here in my ingredients, and all measurements can be made in advance so that those ingredients are all measured, ready to go. So I'm going to go ahead and underline each of the measurements. Please do so as well on your copy. All right, now that I have underlined my measurements so that I know I can do all of those measurements in advance, let's look in detail a little bit at the ingredients themselves. I've got all-purpose flour, I've got baking powder, I've got salt in a cupcake. I'm gonna put salt in something sweet like a cupcake. Why is salt in a cupcake is one question I currently have, so I'm adding that in the comments. Do so for me as well. Let's ask ourselves this question: why are we putting salt in a cupcake? Now I see that I have unsalted butter softened. Well, I'm feeling a little confused again here. Butter is hard. To soften it, I will need to melt it. That's interesting. So I guess if I need softened butter, that's something I'm going to have to do ahead of time. So I'm actually going to go ahead and underline that too to show that that's something I can do ahead of time. All right, so I've got 3/4 cup sugar, 2 large eggs, room temperature. Well, I keep eggs in the refrigerator. So if they have to be room temperature, I'm going to have to get them out of the refrigerator early. So that's something I'm going to have to do ahead of time. All right, 2 teaspoons vanilla extract, 1/4 cup buttermilk, plain kefir. What is that? I'll highlight that in red. And here again it says room temperature, so that's something that I would have to take out of the refrigerator in advance. So I'm going to go ahead and underline that. I don't know though, it's weird. I'm going to have my eggs at room temperature and my milk at room temperature. Isn't it dangerous to have milk and eggs at room temp? I don't know why it's telling me to have those at room temperature. That kind of seems to go against what we learned in food safety. So I'm going to leave myself a question there. Maybe I can do some internet research later on. And I'm also going to want to look up what the heck kefir is, even though it looks like it's some kind of buttermilk substitute. All right, now that I've done some reading of my ingredients, let me look at the instructions. The first instruction says to preheat the oven to 350 and line a cupcake muffin pan with cupcake liners. So I have a couple of action words here telling me what I need to do. I'm preheating the oven and I'm lining my cupcake and muffin tin. And technically, that's all stuff that I'm doing in advance before I actually start the actual baking. So I'm going to go ahead and underline those steps. Let's see. In a medium bowl, whisk. There's an action word. Whisk together the flour, the baking powder, the salt. Set aside. There's another action. I'm just going to put that off to the side. In the bowl of an electric mixer, beat. There's an action. Butter and sugar on medium-high speed, 5 minutes until thick and fluffy. Scraping. Action that I need to take. Down the bowl as needed. Add eggs one at a time. Oh, that's interesting. So earlier I was thinking I'm going to get my eggs out in advance and I'm going to crack them both into a bowl so they'll be sitting there ready for me. But if I'm supposed to add the eggs one at a time, don't crack the eggs ahead of time. I mean, I guess I could have them both in the bowl and then get one of them out of the bowl at a time, but that sounds more challenging to me. It sounds like it's going to make more sense to crack the eggs and then add them once at a time. Okay, looks like I'm doing a lot of this in the mixer at a high speed. Got lots of actions that I'm doing here in this step. I'm going to make sure to get all those highlighted in green so they stand out to me and I know exactly what I'm doing when it comes time to make this recipe. Okay, if I were realistically doing this for students, I'd continue with the rest of the recipe. But at this point, I think you've gotten the point. You're seeing me show my metacognition. You're seeing me point out to students what we were focusing on, things that should and should not be done ahead of time. And that is what modeling this process for students would look like. So let's recap. The marking the text process has 3 main student steps. First, they number the paragraphs. Then they complete a clean read. And then they mark the text, circling key terms and phrases, boxing words that they don't know, underlining important ideas, and writing in the margins. To prepare students for success on these steps, teachers must establish the learning environment, select a meaningful text, define a purpose for reading, and guide students through marking the text. So now what? You're going to take time now to go through the resources within the Marking the Text folder to find tools that you can use with your students. Please reach out to me if you would like help designing any materials that are more catered to your class. Then you're going to consider upcoming objectives in your class and how you can have students achieve those objectives through reading a complex text. Model for students how to mark the text, then gradually release the responsibility to groups and individuals. Once you've done that, you're going to complete the evidence assignment showing how you used the strategy in your class. Happy text marking!